It's the week beginning Monday the 17th of February, and this is Business Unwrapped, brought to you by Lombard Asset Finance. In this bonus series of podcasts, I'm talking to industry experts about innovation and agility in the age of disruption. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the business week. And joining me today with my still slightly sore throat, I apologise for, from the Week's Digital team is Hollie, Clemence, and our special guest is co-director of climate charity Possible, Alice Bell. Hi, Alice.
Hello.
You're writing a book at the moment.
I'm writing a book at the moment, and I have a book out in the end of this month.
How serendipitous.
Yes.
The one that you're writing at the moment presumably is going to come out after the world's ended, because that's how long literary publishing works.
It's autumn 2021, which does seem like quite far off for a climate campaigner, but I'm hoping there will still be trees to print books on around by then.
But what's the current one?
So the one that's out, it's out on the 12th of March, so in about a month, and it's called Can We Save the Planet? Spoiler-ish.
Okay.
It's basically a guide to all of the different things that could kill us in the environment. I mean, there's a whole other book about all the things that could kill us in disease.
But with some good news for people who might want to avoid that happening.
About half of it's on sort of things that we can do to stop it from being really, really awful.
And what story have you brought us this week?
Are carbon emissions flatlining, finally?
This is the dilemma that all of the oil majors face, and it looks like if you look at the statement today, they're trying to do both. They're not saying they're getting out of oil and gas forever. They're still very much committed to what they're doing, but they are talking a lot about trillions of dollars of investment are going to be needed as we rewire the entire global energy system. So clearly there is money to be made outside of oil and gas. Just look at the revolution that we're seeing in battery technology and solar and wind. But you're right, Tom. I mean, that is the question on every investor's lips right now. They can replace some of the revenue, but will they be able to replace all of it over the next 20, 30 years?
Yeah, well done, Tom. That was Bloomberg's John Fraser. Alice, what had Tom been asking him about?
Well, they were talking about the story that I think you covered on last week's podcast, which was about BP saying they were going to go carbon neutral by 2050 and how they were going to do that, whether they could make a business out of the different things they might do. And that relates to this story, which we heard from the IEA last week, that carbon emissions were, for about the first time in about a decade, flatlining.
No, that is a good news story, right?
It's kind of a good news story. It's the sort of good news story that climate campaigners are like, is this what counts as a good news story? It's like, it's better than them going up, but we really need them to be plummeting quite dramatically, and they're not doing that yet. So when BP came out with this big announcement with lots of glitzy press last week, it was kind of exciting to see an oil major talking about these things. But we first of all start saying, well, you're talking about 2050, and that's a while off, and we need them to be not just being carbon neutral, but we need our carbon emissions to be plummeting way before that.
Well, presumably one of the reasons they were talking about 2050 is because the UK is committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050, haven't
Yeah,
we?
they've kind of sort of taken a lead from the UK policy, like a lot of other groups. So people in the climate community are now starting to talk about the Net Zero Club, which are people who've said that they're going to go net zero by 2050. And that includes several countries, but also several businesses. BP aren't the first energy company to come up with something like that, as Ørsted, which they used to be called Dong. And it's kind of shame they changed the name, because Dong is just nice to say, Dong. But that stood for Danish Oil and Natural Gas. They decided they want to get out of oil and gas, so they've changed their name to Ørsted, and they are calling themselves a renewable energy company. And they did this a while ago. They're kind of trying to gradually shift over from oil and gas to renewables, and they had a similar pledge. Now, what we haven't got with BP's announcement is any sign that they're actually going to be stopping on the oil and gas, though, which is what makes it very different from the Ørsted story. And is also, when we're looking at carbon emissions and saying they need to be going down, it's a bit worrying that we're still seeing oil companies saying, and we're still going to be selling oil and gas.
I wonder as well, from an American perspective, bearing in mind they backed out of the climate accord, whether carbon emissions flatlining sort of can be used to say, well, look, it doesn't matter, because even in the US, I believe they're down, aren't they?
When I said earlier, it's a good news story, and it's a kind of good news story that climate campaigners are used to being like, does this count for a good news story? It's a bit slippery. It's always dangerous when we see something that looks a bit like good news. People go, oh, it's all right then. And it's really, really not. And I think we all need to appreciate the enormity of this challenge, and that we've put off taking action on this for so long that the amount of work we need to do is just totting up and up and up. It's not this kind of homework that you can be a bit late on and then your tutor will go, it's all right, don't worry about it. It's the sort of one that just grows and grows and grows.
Okay, but we've got 30 years before we're net zero. Just explain what net zero means for people that haven't got their head around it yet.
This is really worth getting your head around. And it's not very difficult. The net is the key bit. Basically, it means that you can still going to be kind of carbon neutral. So you might still pollute. You might still be pumping out some carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but that you'll have special systems, maybe technologies, maybe tree plantings, but ways of absorbing that carbon. So if you're taking it seriously, you say you're net zero because you think that at this 2050 or whatever date you've set, there'll be some things that you won't be able to do without creating carbon emissions. There are some things that are just going to be really, really difficult to do.
International flight probably is still the case.
Exactly. Electric flying sounds amazing, but we are way off that, particularly for anything like transatlantic flights. A couple of other things, like we're still really challenged to think about how we can decarbonise cement. There's maybe some medical technologies that we still want to emit carbon dioxide for to save lives, whatever. There'll be a little bit of greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to find a way of dealing with that to balance it out.
Okay, and Holly, you've been looking into some of these. What have you found?
Yeah, so it's really interesting thinking about it negatively, because I don't think I'd really got my head around that, thinking, yes, obviously we need to use renewable energy, bring everything down, but the idea of kind of having negative oil, negative carbon oil is quite a new idea in the grand scheme of things. So there's organic ways of doing it, forests and soil and things that will absorb it through photosynthesis, which is great. There's also these technologies which are new and upcoming, which will take investment, and that's kind of the interesting side of it, because some of the oil companies are the ones that are investing all the money in it. But also it looks a bit like greenwashing. Bernie Sanders would say this is kind of a way of them getting out of it. They can still produce all the carbon they want to, as long as they're investing in some other technology that hasn't really found its place yet.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me. Give me a weird way to offset carbon that I haven't heard of.
Direct air capture, which actually takes the carbon out of the air. Climeworks is kind of ahead of the game. It's this Swiss company. They use like a big fan and it collects carbon molecules and then they pump it back into the ground. So it's a way of taking the carbon out of the air and storing it somewhere safe that it can't get out.
And you can even buy some fizzy drinks now that the carbon bubbles in fizzy drinks have been produced using that process. So you might have drunk some of that carbon.
So you can make carbon in a way that stores the carbon elsewhere, but the carbon's in the drinks.
Well, you capture the carbon from the atmosphere and then the idea is you bury it normally or you turn it into something else. That's what the Climeworks do. And
how does it end up in a cola? I don't understand.
Well, you need CO2 bubbles to make the bubbles.
Yeah.
So that we currently use like some of this. The first time, when they first invented fizzy water, they used CO2 bubbles that came out of the brewing process. You can use it from like coal plants and stuff, and this is just one way of using that CO2. But I mean, if you're trying to have negative carbon emissions, you probably bury it.
But are you saying, I'm sorry to like reduce this horribly, are you saying that if you wanted to actually cut all carbon emissions, you wouldn't do fizzy drinks anymore?
I think that's a bit marginal in terms of...
but it's true, is it? It does. I'd never really thought about carbonated drinks.
I mean, there's carbon cycle that happens anyway. Like, we wouldn't breathe out.
Right, yeah, okay. So it's so negatable that it's in that kind of category.
Well, it could just become part of our general carbon cycle. I don't think we need to worry about the fizzy drinks.
I'm not worried, I'm fascinated. I was just,
I don't know, maybe I'm being really dismissive of something and there's going to be an expert out there who's going to tell me that, yeah, we do need to stop drinking fizzy water.
There's lots of other products as well, but I think that's probably where business will come into it. If they can make that, kind of monetize it and make people want to buy things with carbon in it, so concrete or fuels that are made from carbon. The tricky thing is that it takes a lot of energy to convert carbon into anything useful. So then you want to use renewable energy to do that, otherwise you're then producing more problems.
And just contextualise for us, Alice, why this is important. I mean, we've all seen, on the news, glaciers melting, etc. But it's to do with an actual figure, isn't it, of 1.5 degrees centigrade above, was it pre-industrialised levels? That's the number that we need to get to. That's why they've come up with these figures?
Well, yeah, so that's what a lot of our figures are based on, our UN agreement that we're going to try. So after the Paris Agreement, which was 2015, the big UN climate talks. So they have big UN climate talks every year, and every now and again they have a bonus one. But last big bonus one was one in Paris. The next one is this end of this year, and we think it's going to be Glasgow, although British government keep changing their mind about this, but we think it's going to be in Glasgow. It's going to be in the UK anyway, unless the UN says we're all rubbish and takes it away. But we agreed in Paris that we're going to try and keep to 1.5. And when it comes around to Glasgow at the end of the year, they're going to do a stock take of where we are as a world, all the different countries, what they're doing, and see if what we're on track for. At the moment, it looks like we're on track for way above that. These figures help give politicians a way of talking about it and a way of thinking about it. But it's not like at 1.5 we suddenly fall off a cliff, or at 2.5 we all burst into flames. Climate change happens by degree. It happens gradually. It's more, there's a climate scientist in America called Kate Marvel who says it's less a cliff you fall off and more of a slope you slide down. So we've got these agreements that we're going to try and keep to 1.5. Before that, we were talking about keeping to 2. But we're already at about 1 degree global warming. And that is already catastrophic. I mean, we saw what was happening in Australia recently. It's devastating. In East Africa, there are these huge plagues of locusts. I don't know if you've seen that.
We've talked about it on the show.
Good. Well, it's still going on, and this is being exacerbated by climate change. And also, one of the reasons why it's so concerning for people there is it's a risk to their harvest, and they're already suffering from food insecurity, largely because of climate change. So, we can say we've got to do this because we've got to keep to 1.5, but we've got to do it because we've got to avoid any more climate change at all as possible. And honestly, keeping to 1.5 is going to be quite hard anyway.
Okay, and from a household point of view, it's probably quite difficult to think in terms of net emissions. It's easier just to think in terms of reduction, isn't it? But from a business point of view, if you're listening to this and you run a business, let's assume you're not Microsoft, who've already announced they plan to be carbon negative, or even Amazon, who have said they want to be carbon neutral, but you run a business employing 5, 10, 15, 50 people. What can you do?
Well, if you talk about a small to medium-sized business, you can do similar things that you might do thinking on a domestic level. You can make sure your building is well insulated, that you buy renewable energy. You think about the products that you're buying and selling, and how you're talking to your customers and your various partners. I mean, that's a big part of what anybody does in terms of climate action, is talking about it.
But that is all reduction, isn't it? It's not really the net stuff. Should you be thinking about offsetting?
So if that's your question, well, it depends on your business. I mean, all these things really depend on your business. But I mean, offsetting is offsetting is basically cheating. And so it may be that in the short term, thinking about how some of your carbon emissions, thinking about some of the impacts of the things that you are doing through your business, you might want to also invest in things that are going to be going to be working to restore some of the things you're going to be damaging. It's very easy to see offsetting and go, that's fine, I've dealt with that problem and I've balanced out the scales, which is also one of the problems with this net and net zero, is it seems like you're balancing out the scales. But if you do it on a large scale, I mean, where are you shifting this problem to? We've still got one planet Earth.
And that is something that nations are looking at, isn't it? They're looking at credits for carbon, which is basically offsetting.
Yeah, so you might invest in more trees being built around the Amazon, but we can't build them here, for example. But we could mention Dennis, because our founder, Felix Dennis.
Illustrious employer. Go for it, yeah.
Well, his aim was to build a massive forest in Warwickshire, and there's 1.8 million trees have already been planted. So we all get to go and plant trees every so often.
And that was kind of really because of his interest as an environmentalist in a broader sense, isn't it? That was pre-people talking about carbon offsetting. That was just because he thought it was a nice thing to do. If you chop down trees to print magazines, to plant trees. It's the same thinking, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's slightly different, I guess, if you're chopping down trees to plant magazines and then planting some more. When you talk about the scale of the kind of operations of BP, which their carbon dioxide emissions for their operations and their production. So that's not counting all the carbon dioxide involved in burning the stuff they sell you, just them making everything and what they do. It's not that much smaller than that of the whole of the UK. So they are on a very large scale. It's very different from the businesses you're talking about, maybe like 15 to 20 employees. That's very, very different. It's going to be very different scale from Dennis as well. If they're talking about offsetter, you're talking about, it's not just a nice forest in Warwickshire, you're talking about large parts of the world. And unless we all collectively cut our carbon emissions, and that involves very big players like the UK government or BP, where else are you going to plant these things? There's a term an environmental journalist coined a few years ago called green grabbing, which is the process of actually taking land from people and saying, we need it for our offsetting process, because you end up displacing people through some of these projects.
That point about land, that's true of many of the renewable energy drives as well, isn't it?
Totally.
Windmills need land, unless they're offshore, obviously, but I mean, Well, even offshore ones.
So this process of green grabbing can also be used, people talk about renewable energy being deployed in contested areas in some parts of the world, and it becomes a problem. This is the part of the problem with the BP story of like the net zero. Like, it seems fine if you think you can suck up enough carbon dioxide out of the environment through tree planting or this direct air capture thing. Or there's this amazing thing that some people in America are doing where they're trying to use forms of selective breeding and genetic modification to produce trees that will absorb more carbon. So like you have super trees, which would mean you need less space.
That's such a Silicon Valley solution, isn't it?
Well, I think it may be one of the things that we really, really need to survive. You would need so much of that to balance out the kind of carbon emissions that BP are talking about. And so if they're saying they're going to be net zero and yet still be trading oil and gas, that it just doesn't add up. And at the moment, I mean, they said they're going to publish more details about what they plan to do in September, and they might have a clearer plan now. But at the moment, it really does look a bit like they're peddling magic beans. And with all of these things where we talk about direct air capture or just basic tree planting, we always need to be careful about thinking, like, how much carbon is it really going to mop up compared to how much we're producing? And it's very easy for these things to be used as an excuse to delay action. So like Trump's been talking about trees. And he loves trees because it makes it sound like, oh, I don't have to do anything about the oil and gas industry. Well, no, you need the trees and you need to reduce the oil and gas.
Alice, absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Alice Bell, and thank you to Hollie Clemence as well, and to our sponsor, Lombard, which provides forward-looking finance and expertise to British businesses planning for a prosperous future. For more from our series about agility and innovation in the age of disruption, visit theweek.co.uk/disruption. Business Unwrapped will be back in a fortnight's time. In the meantime, do subscribe to our weekly show, The Week Unwrapped, on your podcast app of choice. And these bonus eps will drop into your feed as well. I've been Olly Mann. The music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until next time, bye-bye.